In this section, we're going to look a little bit more closely at the way the poor industrial workers suffered in the Industrial Revolution. The workers, of course, as I've mentioned in a previous section, were often immigrants and they were clumped together in these cities, and there were literally boats loads of them arriving. And so they weren't dissipating and they were an easily exploitable source of labor. And with no regulations of laissez-faire, these factory owners wouldn't pay them anything and would require long hours. People would work of 60 to 90 hours a week and still not make really enough money to live. Wages overall rose from 1870 to 1900, but they were really not even subsistence wages. And factory life was kind of tough in another way. People who had a pre-industrial existence before over in Europe, who'd sort of been used to traditional rural ways, they were mindful only of the seasons, or they mixed work and play, or moved slowly. I don't know, but they were being demanded to be, the disciplined factory workers, required to work steadily, hour by hour, under close supervision, by the clock. All of this was a bit of a cultural shock. It was impersonal and bureaucratic, and a lot of these workers never got the pride of seeing the finished product in an assembly line. This was something that made them really not like their work and uncomfortable. Factory owners would pay women even less than men, and of course women would also face sexual harassment, and there was absolutely no enforcement of prohibitions against that. Children were also exploited, paid less even still. There are different studies, but some have suggested that the percentage of children as workers was as high as 20% of the industrial force in certain states. The children, their small size made them valuable as, for example, slate pickers in the coal mines. And children would begin working in the mines as young as 8 or 9. By the time they grown to adulthood, they would have black lung, and of course there was no workers' compensation, so they would just be disposed of. To make matters worse, there were no safety standards, and working in these factories was flat out dangerous. When you're doing something repetitively on an assembly line over and over again, you tend to lose your concentration, and when you're around this huge machinery, that can be dangerous. For adult workers, the railroad industry was probably one of the most perilous. In 1889, the first year that the Interstate Commerce Commission compiled reliable statistics, almost 2,000 rail workers were killed on the job, and more than 20,000 were injured. And again, there was no workers' compensation. Disabled workers and widows might receive minimal financial aid from employers, but all the employer had to do was just say it was due to employer negligence, and the courts would tend to favor them. The railroad and factory owners, they fought the adoption of state safety and health standards, the grounds that the cost would be excessive. And for sickness and accident benefits, workers joined fraternal organizations and ethnic clubs, part of whose monthly dues benefited those in need. But in most cases, the amounts were way too low to be of much help. And when a worker was killed or maimed in an accident, the family was about all they had really to rely on. Outside of the factory, the life of the poor workers was not any better. There were no health standards or for the places they lived, and so they lived in these squatter tenement apartment buildings, which were just horrible. This is an eyewitness account from 1890. Quote, "Without money for transportation, the poor have to live close to their jobs. For cheap housing, the rooms of old mansions were cut into smaller ones, and multi-storied rear houses were put up in the backs of lots. This was done without regard to light or ventilation, the rate of rent being lower in proportion to space or height from the street, and they soon became filled from cellar to garret with a class of tenantry living from hand to mouth, loose in morals, improvident in habits, degraded and squalid as beggary itself. Neatness, order, cleanliness were never dreamt of, while reckless slovenliness, discontent, privation, and ignorance were left to work out their invariable results until the entire premises reached the level of tenement house dilapidation, containing, but not sheltering, the miserable hordes that crowded beneath smolder, water-rotted roofs or burrowed among the rats of clammy cellars." Unquote. Every major city had its share of rundown, overcrowded slum tenement house neighborhoods. Generally clustered within walking distance of the manufacturing districts, slums developed when landlords subdivided long, narrow buildings with few windows called tenements, and they packed in as many residents as they could. The poor, the renters, the worst of slum. The slums became ghettos when laws, prejudice, and community pressure prevented the tenement inhabitants from renting elsewhere. During the 1890s, Italians in New York, blacks in Philadelphia and Chicago, and Mexican Americans in LA, and the Chinese in San Francisco increasingly became locked in segregated ghettos. Life in the slums was really bad for children. Diseases such as whooping cough or measles and scarlet fever really took a lot of toll, and infant mortality was incredibly high. In one immigrant ward in Chicago in 1900, for example, 20% of the infants died. Since tenements often, they, as we said, bordered industrial districts, they had the noise and the pollution and the foul odors of places like tanneries or foundries, and there's no pollution regulations, and so the smog and soot would just settle on them and their houses. Most of these factories used coal-fired steam engines as their energy source, and coal was also the preferred use for heating apartment houses, and so there's this soot and coal dust everywhere, every day. This concludes the section on how the poor workers lived in the Industrial Revolution.